I will be reading from Acts chapter 18, verses 5 through 6. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that the Christ was Jesus. And when they opposed and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to them, "Your blood will be on your own heads. I am innocent. From now on I will go to the Gentiles."
Thank Clay for reading that passage for us. This is where we're going to jump off in Acts chapter 18. So go ahead and open your Bibles if you haven't already to that passage. And it occurred to me last week when Brittany and I got home and we were talking and critiquing, I suppose. She does a significant amount of critiquing. But we were talking about last week's sermon, and we started eating the cake before we even began to look at it. So we're going to back up a little bit. If you remember, our theme for this year is It Matters, and we're looking at 1 Corinthians is where we're going to spend a lot of our time on Sunday morning in 1 Corinthians, I guess sort of methodically going through that particular book and looking at several of those things. But, you know, we started eating before we even looked at it, so we have no idea, perhaps, about anything about Corinth. So that's what I wanted to spend a little bit of time giving you a sort of an introduction, if you will, to the church at Corinth, to the area, maybe even to some of the problems that they were facing. Because the church at Corinth is interesting, to say the least. It's an interesting church located in an interesting place. And there's a lot of history in Corinth. But the church is what we're focusing on. The church located at Corinth was a church certainly of adversity. A church that was born out of adversity, a church that faced adversity as it grew, and a church, you know, this is what Clay read for us, Acts chapter 18, 5 through 6, you remember. If you go back and look at it, look at what 5 and 6 says, that the Jews opposed Paul. The habit of Paul, as he traveled from place to place, the habit of Paul was to first begin where logically you would begin, with the people who already believed in God, with the people who understood that there was one God. So he would go into the synagogue. The synagogue was a place of worship for the Jews. So he would go into the synagogue with the people who grew up perhaps the same way that he grew up, who was educated, perhaps the same way that he was educated in many ways. So he would begin in his teaching and establishing these churches, he would begin in the synagogue. So he went into the synagogue and he reasoned with them, and they were not very receptive. And Paul's response, if you remember in verse 6, was, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent. And from now on, I'm going to go to the Gentiles," right? So Paul, he started with the Jews in the synagogue, and he says, "Hey, if you're not going to listen, if you're not going to believe or understand or even pay attention to what I'm saying, I'm going to go to people who will. I'm going to go and move on to the Gentiles." Well, it seems as if they didn't like this very much. You know, the Jews were certainly opposed. And this is part of the adversity. The Jews were opposed to the teaching of Jesus. And obviously, that was the case, right? Because we continue reading in Acts chapter 18, and I want to skip a few passages or verses that we're going to come back to. But in verse 12, after Paul says, "Your blood be on your own heads," look at what it says here. Now, when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, now Achaia is the region, the state, if you will, in which, or province, in which Corinth was found. So when Gallio was proconsul of Corinth, and Corinth being the capital there were the seats, and Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal, that is Gallio, saying, "This man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law." But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, if it were a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crime, O Jews, I would have reason to accept your complaint. But since it is a matter of questions about the words and names and your own law, see to it yourselves. I refuse to be a judge of these things. And he drove them out from their midst. And as they left, we see in verse 17, all these people, they seized a man named Sosthenes, who was, at this point, the ruler of the synagogue. You know, the ruler of the synagogue was this guy who would organize perhaps the worship assembly as these Jews came together. So you can imagine, they bring Paul to have him prosecuted, and it ends up that one of their leaders gets beat up. I mean, you can imagine how they would feel about that. You can imagine how they would feel about Paul. You can imagine all the animosity and the hatred that would begin to stem from a situation like this, especially after Paul says, "Hey, your blood be on your own heads," right? I'm innocent of you. I'm going to go to the Gentiles. How dare you talk about our God to the Gentiles? There was certainly opposition from the time that this church began from the Jews. And there's also a certain amount of opposition from the world standpoint, because the world was in Corinth, and I'm talking about the worldly morality, the standards of life. It was contrary to what God teaches us, contrary to what the Spirit reveals to us and what we read in Scripture. In a lot of different ways, it was definitely opposed to Christianity. For instance, in Corinth, there was this huge, massive structure that was solely dedicated to worship Aphrodite. Now, you remember Aphrodite is from your Greek. If you remember anything from middle school, I remember talking about Aphrodite in middle school, the Greek mythology. Aphrodite was the goddess of procreation, the goddess of childbearing. So what that meant is, as you worshiped Aphrodite, how would you do that? Put two and two together, yada, yada, yada. Prostitutes. There was, in this temple to Aphrodite, history tells us, 1,000 prostitutes, more or less, cult prostitutes, that were there for you to, quote unquote, worship Aphrodite. Now, I mean, can you imagine something like that? I mean, we would never, ever put up with anything like that in America, would we? Good grief. And that's how you go to worship? Holy smokes. I mean, you can imagine this huge behemoth of a structure, very elaborate, time-consuming, and that's what you go to do. So there's this huge structure, and you can imagine the opposition from the moral standpoint of the world against the church, where the church says, "Hey, husband and wife, one man, one woman for the rest of your life," right? You can imagine the opposition. There's obviously another amount of opposition if we consider in Corinth its location, because Corinth was in a very interesting location. It was strategically placed in this region of Achaia, and that's why it certainly became the seat, because it was centrally located. And what I mean by that is, I'm going to try to get this to work and show you a map. I thought that might be more interesting than trying to let me explain this to you. But the way in which it is located. Here we have many of the Bible places that you're familiar with. Thyatira, stay for class. Very good class that Larry's teaching in Revelation chapter 2. We read about Thyatira, Sardis, Ephesus, Laodicea, Colossae. But over here is the region of Achaia, okay? And if you remember, there's Corinth. Now, on this little isthmus is where Corinth is located. Now, on one side, you've got this canal to the Ionian Sea, and on the other side, you've got the Aegean, however you pronounce it, Aegean Sea. Now, if you want to get from one place to another, what's a good way to get there? Well, let's stop in at Corinth, right? Corinth is located about 3 or 4 kilometers from one port on the northeast side, and about 5 kilometers from another place that we read about in the Bible, Cenchrea, right? You remember that. Paul visits there a little bit in his second or third missionary journey. But here we have the location of Corinth perfectly placed for immorality. You've got people coming in and out. You've got all kinds of ideas coming in and out. You've got what is Corinth, a major seaport to the northeast, a major seaport to the southwest, and a couple hours walk into the city of Corinth. Now, you've heard the saying, cuss like a sailor. Imagine all the sailors in Corinth. Imagine all the immorality and the different ideas in Corinth. Imagine all the wealth that would arrive in Corinth. Imagine the worldly standards that would be in Corinth. So you can imagine all the immorality that would arrive in a place like this. So the location would give you some idea about the moral standards in which this church was founded, was derived from. And there's also from history, it tells us that there's several sayings that define the moral standing status of Corinth. For instance, to live like a Corinthian was one saying, which meant like you would live a completely immoral life. Amoral life, no standards. To live like a Corinthian. There's also a saying that was common in the day, to have a Corinthian girl would be to have a girl that was, we might say, loose. Very little moral standards and self-respect. A Corinthian girl, to live like a Corinthian. So that gives us a glimpse, okay, as we open up 1 Corinthians, as we look at Acts chapter 18 and the day in which that this was written and founded and to who it was written. So there's a lot of adversity going on in the church. But with this, and specifically with the location, there's certainly a lot of diversity in a church that is founded in a place like this with standards like this. There's a lot of diversity, particularly among the members. You know, there's a lot of different members that we see that are recorded for us in Acts chapter 18, in Ephesians, in 1 Corinthians. You know, there's a lot of different people. We get some of their names. Some of those, if you look on the screen, we've got Crispus, who is here in Acts chapter 18. We see in verse 8 that Crispus is or was the ruler in the synagogue. He was the guy, he was the Jewish leader who was organizing this worship service, who was putting all these things in order. We've got Gaius. Gaius is a very Roman name, but we see that Gaius, the church at Corinth, met in his house. We've got Titius Justus, who, again, a very Roman name. We see that he was one of the first converts of Paul. Undoubtedly, perhaps one of the first converts. Uh, and Paul stayed in his house. We see later on in Acts chapter 18 that Paul stayed in his house after the Jews said, after the Jews weren't receptive to him anymore. In verse 7, Acts chapter 18, undoubtedly hospitable. Chloe, another name that is mentioned. We see in 1 Corinthians that it was reported from Chloe's people. Now that's, those of you who aren't familiar, that's a female name, all right? Now, I don't know what that tells you, but I'm perhaps reading a little bit in between the lines. And there was this woman in Corinth who was a prominent female leader in some capacity who commanded respect. Maybe she had a large family and she was the matriarch of that family. We have Erastus, the first convert, as we see one of the converts of Paul, and Stephanus as well. And you can imagine the diversity that would have made up a congregation like this. You got Romans mixing with Jews, you've got Gentiles, and these people that would undoubtedly be, like Crispus, very steeped in the law of Moses. So to combine these people, what that means is diversity. You've got an incredible amount of diversity. And they would also have, not just the members, but these members, they would bring in a variety of various opinions. They would bring in opinions about an incredible amount of different things. For instance, about the importance of a preacher. If you're a Gentile, if you're perhaps a Roman, the leader, the one that baptized you, he would be the most important one in your life, right? Now the Jews, they're thinking, hey, God is the only one that matters. So we see in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, some say, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Cephas, I'm of Peter. Was Paul crucified for you? No. They would place importance on the preacher, but there's nothing. The preacher is nothing. It's God who matters. So they would have various opinions about the importance of the preacher. They would have various opinions about the grace of God, how far the grace of God, what the grace of God would cover, for instance. And that's what we see in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. There is this immoral situation we'll talk about just a little bit later on, but there's this incredibly immoral situation going on in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. And you would have, obviously, what would be diversity of opinions. Well, how far does God's grace go? Can you continue to live in a situation like this and still obtain the grace of God? Can we associate with someone who is doing like this and still be pleasing to God? A diverse amount of opinions in the moral standards, and in particular about the grace of God. If you continue reading, you've got a diversity in something as simple as we perceive it, something as simple as eating meat. In 1 Corinthians chapter 8, that's what they talk about, eating meat. Now, it's not just eating, going to the butcher and saying, hey, I want some of that. Eating meat offered to idols. Some people cannot eat meat offered to idols because that is something that has been offered to something that is not God. How could you possibly support and endorse something like that? And other people, that's just the way that they grew up. They had no problem doing something like that. So they would have a diverse amount of opinions in regards to something like that. And we also see in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 that they would have, and that they did have, different opinions about what the Lord's Supper meant. We call it the Lord's Supper, right? Supper. But I don't know about you. I don't get very full from a little bit of grape juice and a little tiny cracker, right? But what was going on here in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 is that people would bring full-on meals, right? A meat and 2 vegetables. They would bring that and celebrate the Lord's Supper. And they would eat, not together, they would eat before other people got there. They would celebrate the death of Jesus in a way that Paul says it's better if you don't even do it. Man, a lot of different opinions coming together to begin this congregation. A lot of different diversity. And I think this particular congregation that we see here in Acts chapter 18, and we're going to talk about this year, has a lot of uncertainty. I think that the uncertainty here in 1 Corinthians was something that was underlying many of these issues. Uncertainty. They had in their life a lot of different uncertainty. They had uncertainty in a lot of different ways. You know, for instance, you're a new Christian. What happens if you want to flip over to 1 Corinthians? Let's look at some of these things. What happens in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 when there is a young man who is in an immoral situation? He is sleeping, having sexual relations with his father's wife, his stepmother, we might say. He's having sexual relations with his stepmom. What do? You know, how could you associate with that? This is what happens in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and verses 1 and 2 when there are young Christians struggling, and I believe that these are growing pains, but these are young Christians struggling, grappling with the idea of the grace of God. This is what Paul says. It is reported that there is sexual immorality among you, and of a kind that is not tolerated even among pagans. For a man has his father's wife. And look at what's happening in verse 2. And you are arrogant. They're bragging about it. You're boastful. You are arrogant. Ought you not rather to mourn? Let him who has done this be removed from among you. And you can understand, maybe they were thinking, look at how gracious God is. Look at how forgiving God is. We are even associating with this young boy, and he's sleeping with his mother-in-law, or his stepmom. Good night. How is something like that possible? So the result and what Paul encourages them to do, don't even associate with someone like this. This fellowship, withdraw your fellowship, disassociate with this person. Uncertainty as they wrestled with immorality. And uncertainty, if you continue reading in chapter 6, as they deal with one another, as they deal with Christians, they didn't know necessarily how to treat one another. If you do me wrong, right? If you do me wrong, you know, as a brother in Christ, I'm just going to treat you like anybody else. I'm just going to treat you like someone else in the world. I'm going to take you to court until you pay for it. Well, that's what's happening in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Look at verse 6 and 8. We see, again, growing pains. But brother goes to law against brother, and that before unbelievers. To have lawsuits at all with one another is already a defeat for you. Why not rather suffer wrong? Why not rather be defrauded, but you yourselves wrong and defraud even your own brothers? You can imagine the uncertainty with how you treat and how you interact with one another as you begin from this state in which they were founded. There would be uncertainty, and there was uncertainty in even your relationship with your spouse. You can imagine this huge temple to Aphrodite and the prostitution that would happen on a daily basis. You can imagine that in your minds that the sexual relationship would be of the devil. That sexuality would be something that you shouldn't participate in, that you shouldn't even consider, even with your spouse. At least that's what it seems, as they're saying in verse 1. This is something that they had written to Paul about. He says, now, chapter 7, verse 1, now concerning the matters about which he wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. This is what they wrote. It's good for a man not to have sexual relations. So how do you treat your spouse when you're coming out of a world of idolatrous and immoral worship? They would certainly struggle with this idea. You continue into chapter 10, and there's uncertainty with how you interact with the world. You know, what is the world? How do we be in the world but not of the world? What does that look like? How do we live like Christians when there's immorality all around us? And Paul's answer there in chapter 10, verse 21, he says, you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? You see, you cannot participate in the things of the world and still claim to be a Christian, still claim to be a follower of God. How is that even possible? They had uncertainty about their interactions with the world. They also had certainty about, what the end. The end. What is the end going to be like? What is it going to look like? There are some people that were there at Corinth. They believed that there was going to be no resurrection. Maybe some influence of a Sadducee, but they didn't believe that there could possibly be a resurrection after one passes away. But look at what Paul says there in 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 12. Now, if Christ is proclaimed as raised from the dead, how can some of you say that there is no resurrection from the dead? There certainly is, isn't there? They had a lot of uncertainty about many things. And much of that was born from the diversity in the church and born out of the world's influence in the church. Because as it began from its establishment there at Corinth, it was born out of adversity. You see, the church at Corinth, it struggled. From the very beginning, it was a constant struggle. And I believe that's one reason we're going to talk about it. And that's why we've given it this title this year of It Matters. Because it does matter, doesn't it? Even when we struggle, even when we are uncertain about the things that God desires for our life, it matters what we do. It matters how we act. It matters how we interact with one another, with the world. You see, the church at Corinth, it struggled. It struggled a lot. But there's still the promise of heaven. At the end of all of this, at the end of 1 Corinthians, he talks about heaven. He talks about the resurrection from the dead. He talks about living a faithful life. He talks about standing firm, act like men, be strong, and let all you do be done in love. Yeah, that's the lifestyle that God needs. Because in the end, it matters. It matters how you act. Perhaps you're here this morning and you're not acting the way that you ought to. Maybe you're letting the world's influence you rather than your light shine in the darkness. Maybe you need some encouragement. Maybe you need to get right with God and be baptized. Do it now.